Greetings everyone, I'm Mar, and once again this is my opinion. Like many of you who were raised in the 90s, I grew up on video games. I started with the NES Classic, played a handful of the classic games, Super Mario Brothers, the original Donkey Kong. Once or twice played Ninja Gaiden, but I didn't hit the big part of my video game fandom until the 18-bit war started when it was Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo. And I had both systems. I had the Genesis at home, and I had the SNES at my other grandmother's, so I got to play a lot of those games. I didn't play every game in the library. For Sega, it was mainly Sonic, a couple Power Rangers games, handful of others here and there. Whereas for SNES, it was a couple Ninja Turtle games that I still have, Donkey Kong Country, the port of the original Mario Brothers games, Super Mario World, and occasionally some games that would catch my eye that I would rent from Couch Club Video, which was the video store that we rented a lot of movies from, and as a side note, it's how I got introduced to some of the Godzilla sequels. Then this fandom continued into the next generation, and I primarily had the Nintendo 64 and played whatever games, struck my fancy. I didn't rent that many for that. Now, I still had access to a PlayStation through my older brother Joseph, because that was the system he got. And whatever games I played for that was restricted to whatever games he had, either games he bought, games he borrowed, games he rented. And like with the Genesis, because he had one at one point too, I would sometimes watch him play, and other times just build off of what games he had. Now, one game he had at one point was the original Final Fantasy VII, and that was my introduction to that game. Now, I didn't watch him directly play all of it, but I did see him play stuff off and on. The one moment that really comes to mind that I saw him play was a certain moment with Kate Sith finding out, we got a spy here. Other than that, most of what I remember from the story was me playing through it for the first time. Now, my brother also had the guide, which I ended up getting after he finished the game. I actually still have it. It's up in my closet as we speak. I was too lazy to rummage through it to get it out. It's in kind of bad shape. It's the shape it's in. It's one of those ones that if your parents went through your room and threw stuff away, and you asked where that was, you mean, oh, it looked tattered. I threw it away. You'd be like, what? The sacred texts. Well, I sat down with the guide, played through the game, bit by bit, disc by disc, and I fell in love with the role-playing game genre because through the previous two generations, I had not played any RPG games. I was aware of the genre, like in certain gaming magazines, I'd see pictures from Super Mario Brothers RPG, the previous Final Fantasy games, but I never actually played any. I don't remember the timeline exactly, but I think the only RPG game I'd actually seen before this was another PlayStation 1 involving dragons and fighting your father. I actually don't know the name of it. It's one I actually want to track down. I believe also Brave Fencer Musashi, which at the time that this is being recorded, I actually have ordered a used copy of that, so that's going to be a future Let's Play. A game I've been wanting to play for over 20 years. I'm finally going to get around to playing it. But I fell in love with this game, fell in love with the genre, and been like that ever since. Final Fantasy VII, the game, that made me fall in love with the entire genre. If it wasn't for the original Final Fantasy VII, and going forward by extension Final Fantasy IX, I would not have fallen in love with Kingdom Hearts, Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, The Dark Tower, Game of Thrones, The Witcher, God of War, would not have delved more into Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, and all that. My love of all that goes back to me getting invested in this video game, so it has a good place in my heart. Unlike a certain survival horror game that was remade in '02, Final Fantasy VII didn't really need a remake, but it falls into the category of, while unnecessary, it's not unwanted. The little nuances are different, and the pacings are different as well, but the overall story beats are the same. And when they finally did announce that they were doing a Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I saw the initial trailer and saw some of the initial game footage, that was my thought. That looks like that they're going that route. That it's going to be similar to the original, but it's going to be different as well. So, a little bit like the Resident Evil remake in that regard, only going to be a lot more expanded. Now, when I heard that they were going to do the first part mainly Midgar, and then release the game in episodic parts, I was for that as well. Mainly because this is a game that you could do for some expansion just from a lore standpoint and from a world building standpoint. Because as much as I love the pacing in the original game, some part of it, if you were to, say, for example, adapt the story to a different medium, the pace at part would be like, okay, that's a little fast. But it's one of those things that, because of the technology of the PlayStation 1, how stories were told in video games at that time, and also with how that game was programmed, and I think you know all about the glitches and everything from the original Final Fantasy VII, it works. Now, to do a remake, expanding on the story in parts will be good. Then the remake hit stores, and even before the official release date, the polarization began. And I tried to stay away from all the different YouTube videos. Like, I saw a couple of them with just some scenes out of context, including a certain scene I'm going to talk about when I address certain elements of the game I was wondering about. But having played through it, I can say with certainty that this polarization is not unwarranted. Now, this is a pretty good remake. It does what I thought the remake was going to do. Takes the initial story, just takes the Midgar section, expands on it, builds on it, expands on the lore, expands on the world building. But then also you could tell this is a game made by a Square Enix that is post-Kingdom Hearts. Some of that's good, some of that is take it or leave it. The gameplay mechanics is one of the things that was going to make or break this game. Because the original was turn-based combat, which I know some gamers are not a big fan of that. I like it. And it's part of the charm of the original game, because you gotta strategize and be like, alright, how are we gonna fight these guys? You could have still done that, but they went for a halfway point between turn-based combat and a more modern style based on Kingdom Hearts, and to a lesser extent what they did in Crisis Core. That's a little different because you're only playing as one character in that game. So that one's a little bit more in line with the Kingdom Hearts philosophy, hack and slash type style that became prevalent in a lot of RPG-esque games in the 2000s. They took that basic element, made it to where you could switch between characters in order to keep with the feel of having a party, which I do like. It does allow for some interesting little moments in combat, like depending on how you have materia equipped, weapons equipped, where your party members are running around the battlefield. You could be hacking and slashing one with Cloud, then you jump to Barret for a long distance attack, then you can jump to either Tifa or Aerith, depending on where you are in the story mode, to use a healing attack. So many possibilities, and I really do love that part of the combat. Now, how they integrated the turn-based battle system into it was, in order to do stuff like magic and special abilities, anything other than firing shots or hacking and slashing, you have to wait for your bar to fill up. And while I appreciate the effort that they went through to design that and implement it in the game, there were a handful of times while playing that I was like getting a little frustrated, getting a little annoyed by it. And it was mainly during the few parts in the game that I did die repeatedly. Yeah, a couple of those parts are right after Corneo sends you into the sewers. Although that one's kind of embarrassing. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot about fire. I forgot fire does damage to him. And then be like, okay, dodge that, dodge that. Hell House, that one took me a couple times. And of course, a certain robot you fight going up to the Shinra building. That guy took about 3 times, but that was more a case of me having the wrong type of weapons equipped in the wrong materia and the wrong people. But it did get annoying because that system did contribute to some deaths. Just one of those things where I'm like, did they even need to do this turn-based system? I mean, it's nice that they did that little tribute to the original, but it's like, feels unnecessary at times. It feels like it hinders you, but on that same token, it means you got to use your brain a bit more while fighting certain enemies. You got to strategize. You got to be like, all right, I got to make sure I plan this use of magic to where I fire the ability and he doesn't counterattack beforehand, or if he does after, I can dodge. Because there were a handful of times in certain boss battles where I would be using a higher level magic ability that the enemy was weak against, and before I could even fire it, boom! I just wasted the magic! Which is another little minor thing, is that the stronger the ability with some of the magics, the longer the load time. But it's one of those things that you gotta strategize around, like I said. Now, like a lot of you, one element of the game I was wondering how they were going to interpret in this remake was the Honeybee Inn, and more specifically, its relation to Cloud's cross-dressing. Because in the original, he approached the drunk guy, asked for the dress, and then you can go do the side quests in order to get better elements to go with it, the wig, the different makeup, and all that. And depending on which ones you get, you either get sent into the room with the goons, where you gotta reveal yourself and then go, that's not a woman, I'm a man. Or you go in there with Corneo and you almost kiss. By the way, in the remake, that's the option I got. Which just had me chuckling for other reasons. Like, you just heard him speak and yet you don't know yet. You just think it's a deep-voiced lady that's big. Or as my friend Alan would say, Corneo wants to climb Mount Woman. Well, how they reinterpret it, instead of a straight-on brothel, like it was implied to be in the original, it's now a nightclub. Possibly a gentleman's club, but we don't see any stripping. The most graphic thing we see in there is the female workers dressed up like honeybees like they were in the original. But it's a decent enough thing. And of course, Cloud gets his dress there because the owner likes his dance moves. But they did still add something suggestive to the story around Cloud getting that. It's a little bit before you do that mission, and it is Madame M's hand massage parlor. And if you are noticing the entendre and implications, and if you are noticing the innuendo and the fact that that name is a double entendre, and if you are noticing the innuendo and implications with the name of that place, you are not alone, because it seems to be intentional. But it is literally a hand massage parlor, isn't it? But the way the scenes around the massages are constructed, you get the implication, especially if you get paid a 300 gil for the top one. That one is like, Cloud just literally got a hand job, a literal hand job. But even though there's no actual sexual contact, the way that the scene is built with this implication is still funny. So they still did manage to get some of that suggestiveness into the scene without there being anything too graphic or controversial. Although I can imagine there'd be certain people that might call this controversial. Now, with the whole dubbing thing, I will say that that scene actually is played out better in the original, at least when it comes to... I would say that scene, when it comes to the dubs, I will say that scene is played out better in the English version, if for only Cloud's moans. Now, there is something about them in the Japanese one that works, but it comes off more acting than in the English one, where you're like, he is getting pleasure from what she's doing to his hand. And of course, there's 3 different outcomes you can get depending on which massage you do, and seeing how Cloud reacts and how Aerith is like looking at him afterwards. But it just adds to it. And Madame M, you just gotta love her character. I hope she does pop up again in later installments of the game, even though the only one that would make sense would be when they return to Midgar. But you never know, you might see her outside of Midgar, considering what happens with Corneo. if they put in the whole go to Wu-Tai mission, which given what they imply in this one with the expansion of Avalanche, they probably will include that and then expand on it. Make it more than just a tourist town, or probably be tourist town. I do like how the game implements limit breaks into its system. A couple of them are regular moves, like Cloud and Barrett's level 1 limit breaks are actually just normal moves. I mean, you gotta wait for your bar to build up, but then you can just go and use them. Whereas their next up limit breaks are actual limit breaks. One thing that I did find annoying about the limit breaks is, unlike the original game where, let's say you get your limit bar built up and then the battle ends and you can carry over to the next battle. And here it's use it or lose it, which I found out the hard way. It's like, I'll save it for the next battle. Then the battle ends, like, really? That's a little annoying. It's like, there's no reason for your limit just dissipating once the battle ends. No reason whatsoever. The weapon system, like in the original, you do acquire better weapons as you go throughout the game. But the twist with this is you can increase the power of each weapon. So it's not like you get your first sword for Cloud and then the Buster Sword becomes completely useless like it does in the original. Here, you can upgrade that weapon, but then you can go back and upgrade the Buster Sword, and it could potentially be better than the next weapon. By the end of the game, the Buster Sword was one of the ones that I was still using as a default, even though the other weapons might have some slightly better stats. But it's one of those things with the gameplay where you gotta mix and match materia to weapon to your armor and go back and forth. And also, like later Final Fantasy games, 9 comes to mind, certain weapons can teach your character certain abilities. Like with Barrett, the only reason I had his weapons that are essentially melee weapons and not long distance weapons was for him to learn special abilities. And the moment he mastered it, alright, going back to one of the guns. And then with Tifa, I was going back and forth between all the different gloves. Alright, this one I'll just teach her an ability. This one's going to be my go-to for her to show us those Fists of Fury. And I do like how each of the characters plays differently. Obviously, Cloud, a lot of hacking, slashing due to the Buster Sword. Barrett's good for the long-distance attacks. And I did find myself putting a lot of battle materia on him. Tifa, good, for rushing in, punching. I did a balance with her, a couple offensive materia, and then a cure. Aerith, I mainly used her as a white mage, as I think everybody has. Give her a cure materia and then one offensive materia. And the only time I really played as her is if I needed to actively set a cure, or of course using her limit break, or if I was fighting an enemy who was weak against the materia I had set on her. Usually it was either ice or fire, but then a couple times I would take those off and put lightning on just to spam lightning if it was a machine enemy we were against. Midgar's design. Ugh. That's definitely a big improvement, but that shows the difference in the capabilities of the PS1 to the PS4. It's a big jump. The sector's all been expanded. You definitely feel like you're in a slum. You did in the original, but here they really nail home that we're in a slum, and also the differences in the areas within the individual slums. A couple areas you really feel like, oh, something really did fall here. This is crumbling. When you get to Wall Market, you're like, alright, we're still in the slums, but this is the upscale part of it where some people have money. They're using it to make some of the lives better, but there is some criminal activity going on here. The Mako reactors, you definitely felt you were in a reactor, that it was a government facility. A lot of bells and whistles to go through. You're like, if you actually work for the company going through here, high security, they don't want anyone to cause any damage. And they have precautions just in case they are attacked. And of course, finally, when you get to the Shinra building, you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely a government facility. The gameplay is split up into several different chapters. And as you progress through it, you're like, alright, so this is how they're splitting up the Midgar story. This is how they're expanding certain areas. And for about 90% of it, I did agree with it. Like, the first mission, more or less the same, just a little bit longer. The aftermath of the mission they do expand on. You actually get to see a little bit more of the plate section of Midgar. You do have a couple missions in between the first two bombing missions, which makes sense. Because you want to make sure that the heat dives down a little bit before you go on to your next one. Gotta steal some stuff for the mission. That's where Orochi, the soldier third class that Cloud fights, comes into play, which, if there's any disappointment regarding his character, it's that he's only in that level. The way that they were building him up in the trailers and everything, I thought he was going to be a reoccurring character, like you'd fight him again once you get to the Shinra building. I mean, even if he is kind of a renegade soldier third class, that would have made sense. That would have been interesting. Like, in addition to the normal Shinra soldiers that you encounter as Cloud, which then mentioning Kunsel was a nice little bit of continuity, even though the whole thing about them saying, oh, Crisis Core doesn't tie in. It's like, it ties in a little bit, or at least there's some shared continuity between the different continuities. Shows that not all the Shinra soldiers are basically drones. They do remember some of their friends. Of course, it's going to be very interesting if he encounters them again later once he does get his true memories back. Fitting for a mercenary, Cloud does have to do a lot of side missions in a couple of these chapters. The first time you do this is in between the two missions, and then later on, once you're with Aerith, you got to do more. And then before you go to save Aerith from the building, you got to do more. Now, you technically don't have to complete all of them to advance in the game story mode wise. I mean, for the first set of them, I actually just did a couple and then just left, which I guess did affect my options for Tifa's dress later in the game. But for the next two sections, I did everything. And I got Cloud's best dress out of it, and I did the last one mainly just for the experience and the gil. And the only reason to do it is for small story moments. Now, pacing-wise, more so later on, it makes you scratch your head going, wait a minute, wouldn't this kill too much time and cause stuff to happen? But it's one of those things where, like, that's video game logic for you. Just like in Skyrim, if you're going to do all the side missions first, it's not like Alduin wouldn't have taken over the world by then. It's part of your suspension of disbelief. But it does build on the lore of the world and show the people that live in Midgar, so it's kind of a balancing act there. Even though they do contribute to some of the world building, if there's any parts of the game that I'm not a big fan of, even though they contribute to the world building, if there's any aspects of this expansion I'm not the biggest fan of, it's when you're in the underbelly of the Sector 5 plate and the ass end of the train graveyard. That just came across to me as expanding on elements of the game just to fill time. If this was an adaptation of, say, a manga, it would be a filler episode right in the middle of a story moment that's just there to make an episode. One part that comes to mind is Naruto Shippuden, where his clones go on strike and take him hostage while he's being taken to the island to hide him with Killer Bee. I mean, there's probably a better example, but it's in that camp. Like, that's unnecessary. It was fun to play, and like I said, added to the world building, but unnecessary. I knew the gameplay was going to be different. I knew that aspects of the story and the world building were going to be different. But one thing I knew I was going to take a little bit getting used to was the voices. If you've seen some of my other videos, like my Sailor Moon review, you know that when the voices change, it takes a little bit of time for me to adjust to them. But it really didn't take me too long. I mean, I'd already knew Cloud and Barrett, what their voices sounded like. And I am of the opinion that the voice they have here for Cloud does sound like a younger version of his character from Advent Children. I mean, the Advent Children actor has a slightly deeper, darker voice. But that fits a more brooding Cloud post Final Fantasy VII, where this lighter one fits a more youthful Cloud. And then once I heard all the rest of the voices they had for the rest of the cast, I thought they fit. And I know, just from reading some of the comments online, that some of my Final Fantasy VII fans don't share that opinion. But having played through the rest of the game since reading these, I just scratch my head and go, It's one of those things that I guess we respectfully agree to disagree. Now, if there's any voice that probably could be done a little bit better, that would be Sephiroth's. In the remake, he's voiced by Tyler Hoechlin, if I'm pronouncing his name right. You all know him as the TV Superman from the Supergirl show. His voice, it fits the character, but it seems a bit lighter. I guess you could say it fits the Sephiroth who is just coming back into consciousness after being gone for a couple years, as we find out with the backstory. There's just something a bit off about it, but then again, maybe that's because I'm just used to how Sephiroth sounds when it's a totally different continuity Sephiroth, as in Kingdom Hearts, or it's a Sephiroth who has returned once again, and everything's real personal like it is in Advent Children. The way Tyler voice acts the character might change as it goes on, and it also is going to depend on how they work in the story change that I'm about to address. But it's one of those ones that all the other voices I liked, and they definitely are how I picture the character sounding. But if there's one voice thing I can't mention without laughing, it's how they had Barrett work in the victory theme. Just the way he does the dun 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 dun. I don't want to use any offensive words with this, but that's the part of his voice acting where it's like they make him sound stupider than what he actually is. I just mentioned it, but there's one story element that they put in Remake that and I probably speak for a lot of people when I say that, the entire fandom wasn't expecting, and that is the Whispers, Sephiroth, and Jenova. Now, Jenova showing up makes sense from the standpoint that her body is in the Shinra HQ, so if they want to put a new Jenova boss battle in there, it makes sense. Actually, seeing Sephiroth, he's there. In the original game, it made sense not to see him, to hear people talk about him, because of how that game was paced and we got it all at once. In a more episodic release, it makes sense to at least see him. You can take or leave the actual fight with him. I liked it. It was a good little gameplay experience, even though it took me 2 times to get through it. Whether or not they actually should have put it there for story reasons, that's one of the ones you can argue back and forth. I'm not really going to cast judgment on whether it is actually a good story decision until the entire game is out there and then play through it all in one go. But as of right now, I'm like, it's fine. But the one thing that I wonder about is, why are they working in the Whispers? It seems like they're trying to integrate some type of weird time travel thing, or trying to explain why the remake timeline exists at all. It is pretty weird, especially if Sephiroth's consciousness from the future is going in the past. There's a lot of my fellow fans seem to be speculating. The game, or at least in the English dub, is kind of vague on it, but that seems to be what's going on, especially since they're talking about changing fate, staying with fate, and the Whispers seem to be trying to prevent fate, or destine fate from transpiring. And there's a couple moments where the characters are fighting against fate, essentially. But if it is time travel, why hasn't Sephiroth ever shown this ability before? I mean, how he keeps coming back because of the Jenova cells makes sense in a weird Lovecraftian sense, that as long as Jenova cells exist, somehow Sephiroth's consciousness can just reform in a new body. It's weird. It kind of gives it a body snatcher vibe, and you're like, ew. It also makes you wonder, Cloud does have Jenova cells in him, so does that mean that if something happened, that technically Sephiroth could revive through Cloud? It's one of those weird little things. And I guess this kind of explains his broody attitude in Advent Children. Is this a new ability he discovered after being destroyed by the live stream? Was his mind sent back in time because of the live stream? If that's what they're going with, I hope it's something they explain throughout the course of the game. On one hand, this whole little weird time travel fate thing does keep you guessing about how they're going to tell the rest of the story. But it also makes you wonder, are they going to change things too drastically after this point? Because having that time travel thing in the first part, just from a meta standpoint, is a little funny. Because it's like, well, it is a remake, so might as well put some type of meta humor and commentary in there. But if they drastically change the story too much, it's going to be one of those picket fence things. I mean, just look at another remake that came out this year, the Resident Evil 3 remake. Because of how they cut certain things from that game, a lot of the fans are rioting, in which I haven't played it firsthand, but I watched one of my good friends, Michael King, play it, and just from watching his playthrough, other than the clock tower being cut, I don't see the issue. And maybe it's the speedrunners, which, as I've said before, unless you're trying to get some of the special weapons, I don't see the point of speedrunning. I actually like to enjoy playing my games. This whole thing, the biggest issue I see arising is if they change a certain moment related to Aerith. Some people will be happy, some people will be mad. If they do change, it's going to all come down to how they change it, what they replace it with, if anything, and if it feels like it's deserved. Personally, I think that after this, how they remake the rest of the game should more or less maybe not feel like a 100% full direct translation from the original game, but enough of a direct translation from the original game to where it feels like, even though it's a different timeline from the original game, that they're more or less not interchangeable, but you could see one to the other. Think of it like two separate adaptations of the same source material. How you see the parallels and you see the similarities, but you also see the differences. You know, expand on certain moments, maybe drop some unnecessary moments, but keep the pacing up. Like, I can already imagine, depending on how far they want the second part, the third part to go, certain moments that could be game enders. Like, technically, the whole thing with Sid could technically be the end of the second game if they want to have it include that much stuff and not compress too much. Or the whole boat thing could be the end if they just want the rest of the continent to be its own thing. It's going to depend on how they do pacing. If they really want to drag it out, it could be 10 games, which I think that would be annoying, especially if they charge $60 for each installment. As a whole, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is a pretty good game. While the Sephiroth and Whispers inclusions are controversial, and they may or may not hurt the rest of the remake depending on how later entries are constructed, the gameplay, the voice acting, the story from the lore to the world building, it all makes for a very entertaining game. It draws you in, you stay, you want to play more, you want to replay it, and that is the sign of a good remake. While I will admit I haven't played it since I beat it, that's mainly because I haven't been in a video game mood since then, and I've been processing everything just for this video, and then plus I was mainly on furlough when I was playing it, so I had nothing else to do, and then now, with work and all that, I gotta spend what little time I have when I get home doing a lot of other stuff. But if you are a long-time Final Fantasy fan like I am and you haven't played the game yet, I would say it is worth a play. If you're on the fence because of stuff you've heard, if you want to wait until the price goes down, borrow the physical copy from a friend, do that. But it is at least worth a playthrough. If there's one thing I'm wondering though about it is, why is the soundtrack not on iTunes?